Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone in the room. Welcome everyone in the room. Welcome everyone who's joining us virtually. And welcome to those of you who are watching this session after it has taken place. It's an absolute privilege to be here this afternoon and to be part of an incredible panel where I am just guiding the proceedings to the end. And we're joined by Mary Frances, who will be joining us virtually. And will be talking to us about the science of grief and loss and the surprising, I suppose, elements of hope that we derive out of that. We're also joined in the room by Dominic Campbell, who has been leading this whole Creative Brain Health Week. And it's just amazing to have such an incredible week happening at such an opposite time in the world. And then we're joined by Becca Strain, who is an artist and who I think is going to be doing a fabulous interactive activity with us. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm not going to say much more than that, except to get the proceedings to start off. And I know that Dominic is going to talk us through the overview of the session, and then we'll be joined by Mary Frances. Is that right?
So we're going to introduce you to a little exercise. Then we're going to introduce Mary Frances and the Neuroscience of Grief. And then we're going to come back with Becca and myself, pretty much in that kind of shape. Okay. Do you want to?
Okay. So some of you have been offered a stone in a box. And inside the box, you'll find a little piece of yarn. And you'll also find a needle in a piece of paper that has some instructions. So if you don't follow my instructions here today, you can take it home and have a look at it. So this is how to tie a Maori lashing rock wrap. And so for those of you who don't know, rock wrapping is a thing. It's the big thing of 2022. So you heard it here. So we're just doing this just to be on trend. Yeah. So we get a rock, any rock. It kind of helps if it's a kind of precious rock. In Donegal, we're always collecting rocks. And it appears that a lot of people have a box of rocks at home. So as per the instructions, you put your string over the top of the rock like that. Give it a bit of space. And then basically what you're doing is taking this at a right angle and wrapping it round. And I'll show you, I'm probably too far away from you to see this, but anyway. And you wrap it over and back like that. So that on one side it's an X, on the other side it's like a H. And you just keep going like that. And you can wrap rocks together. And what I've done as well is I've wrapped I've written small pieces of writing and then folded them up and put them underneath the wrap. And then once you have your rock wrapped, you can keep it on the mantelpiece, or you can throw it in the sea, or you can put it in the garden. But you're just kind of spending a bit of time pulling that thread really tight and keeping the tension going the whole way round. Where am I? Stay focused, Rebecca. Now, some people will do this really neatly. I'm not a terribly neat person. I can be, but sometimes I'm not. And it'll depend on the shape of your stone, how it actually works out. So, at the end, you've got something like that. And you pull this over, so it's nice and neat. And then you need to, this is the exciting bit, not trying to thread the needle whilst holding a rock. No, we're all good, we're all good. Yeah, so you thread the needle whilst holding the rock, and you basically tie it off. There's a really nice way of tying it off, so it's really nice and secure. And so this rock wrapping was something that we did as part of our Compassionate Culture Network meetings that we were doing in Buncrana. So you put that thread in under there, like that, and then under here like that. And then you do, I don't know, I used to be in Scouts and I used to know the names of these knots. Under here, down here, down here, round there. It's in the instructions. I made it really clear. And also, a really great guy has made a video of this. So you can do that. So basically, you just knot it off like that, and then tuck that bit under, and do the same on the other side. And then you have a lovely, it's quite primal looking, isn't it? It does look like we could go out and, like, I don't know, use it as a thing. There you go. You've made a thing, and you can keep it in the box.
These are the rocks of Donegal, coastal erosion in the person of Rebecca, one person, coastal erosion. We thought we'd bring them to you because they're something that developed from the Compassionate Culture Network, which we're going to talk about in a while. What we might do, though, is go first to the Neuroscience of Grief and to invite Mary Frances O'Connor to join us.
Hello, everyone.
Lovely to see and hear from you. Hello. I'm just going to hand over to you.
Brilliant.
Yeah, Mary, take the floor.
Well, I'm just so grateful to be here. Of course, I wish I was there in person instead. That would be much preferable to me. And maybe someday in the future I will be. But for now, the magic of technology has brought me from around the world, where I am in Tucson, Arizona, where I teach at the University of Arizona and do research and direct the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, which is a lab really devoted to looking at the consequences of grief, of bereavement, of loss, the impact on the mind and the brain and the body. And so I'm really fortunate to be a part of this with you here today. The title of my talk is The Creative Brain on Grief and Hope. And hopefully, I think by taking the perspective of the brain, which is not the first perspective people think of usually, but it gives us a new way to think about the process of grieving. And for me, has been very helpful in considering what it is that we're grappling with when we lose, when we have the death of a loved one. So in order to help you to understand the neurobiology of grief, I like to tell a story. And for this story to make sense, you have to know the premise behind the story. And so you just have to accept this premise. And the premise is that your dining room table has been stolen. I'm not really sure why your dining room table has been stolen, but that's not material to the story. So you wake up one night in the middle of the night and you're a bit thirsty. And so you decide to get up out of bed and go to your kitchen to get a glass of water. And as you walk through your dark house, as you get to cross the dining room in order to go into the kitchen, as you get to the point where you would bump the table, you feel the gap. Right? You feel the space that is missing where the table should be. And this is a very difficult thing for a neuroscientist to explain. We think of something in the world as causing us to have a reaction, a sensation. But in this case, it is the absence of something which is causing a sensation in us, which is causing us to feel where the dining room table should be. And I think this is not only a metaphor for grief and loss, for the experience we have of carrying the absence of a close person with us through the rest of our lives, but is probably also actually how the brain is working. And let me show you some data that might help you to consider how the brain might be encoding this experience. There's something in the brain called object trace cells, and this is how they work. So if we take a little rodent And we give this little rodent a box that has not a rock in it, although a rock would work as well. But it has a blue Lego tower. You see that little blue tower in there. And every day the rat goes and hangs out in this little box and checks it all out. It's actually a pretty boring little box, but nonetheless, the blue tower is the interesting piece of what's going on there. In this data slide, what you see is the activation in the neurons of this little rodent as they're checking out the space. And so that square that you see, the blue square, is the shape of the box. And the rat is actually able to encode all of that location, all of those areas. And then you see there are object cells. These are neurons that are specifically firing when the rat encounters the blue Lego tower. And so you see him moving around there, and you see the red and yellow and green firing when he's in the location of the object. So before, when there was no blue tower, you see nothing. Then during the time when he's in with the cells, with the tower, you see the cells firing. And then afterwards, after we take the blue tower away and he keeps going back to the box, eventually we don't see any firing again because there is no blue tower. But here's the fascinating piece. It takes many days for the rat to recognize that the object is gone. And so on day 0 and day 1 and day 2 and day after day, because the rat is expecting that there should be a blue tower in this area, those object trace cells are still firing. They are still expecting the box to be there in the way that we might expect our dining room table to be there. And by analogy, that in the many, many scenarios in which we expect our loved one to be there, our brain actually requires time to rewire, to update, to understand what is true about the world now. And that's a physical process. I think this helps me to understand in part why grieving takes so long. If you can imagine that something as simple as a blue tower in a box can take 11 days to really understand that the blue tower is not there any longer. Imagine how many days and weeks and months it takes for our brain to really predict that we won't wake up next to our loved one again. It's a long process. And for this reason, as I look across a lot of different grief research, I have come to think of grieving as a form of learning. It is learning on lots of different levels. It's learning about habits, right? So this is the experience of, after my dad died, I'd still pick up the phone to call him when something happened that he would find funny. And then after I had picked up the phone, I would remember that I couldn't call him any longer. And that habit, the prediction your brain makes, enables you to just sort of run through the behavior that you would have engaged in. And it takes a long time to change those habits. But it isn't just about habits. There are other pieces as well. So really, in many ways, it's also about restoring a meaningful life. Restoring a meaningful life, living in a way that reflects the fact that you have loved and been loved by this person, means that you carry the absence of that person with you. You continue to reflect on the relationship that you had. And for many people, because of the difficulty of learning what your life is like now, what is important to you now, how to be in the world, because this is an infinite number of possibilities of how you might live in the world, I also think of it as a creative process. It is the development of something new, something you've never done before, and something that is deeply meaningful to figure out how to live in the world, carrying the absence of this person. And the reason that it needs to be a creative process, I believe, is because learning isn't really something we can rush, right? one advantage to thinking of grieving as a learning process is that learning is a little bit more familiar. We've been learning our whole lives. And so to think of it that way, I think enables us to remember that learning is frustrating sometimes, and it takes a long time, and it very rarely happens in a linear trajectory, does it? It's sort of, you learn something and then you think, well, maybe that's not it, and you try again. In particular with grieving, I think that there's an additional reason why learning takes so long. So, for example, if I teach a class, which I do every term, at the end of that class, the students that I've been getting to know that sit in, particular seats in that classroom, they will go away. And when I come back to the classroom the next term, I don't expect to see them there again, right? This is not a long learning process for me. Fortunately, I update pretty quickly, and I think, oh, well, now I have a new class. These are different students sitting in these seats. I think that attachment bonds with our one and only are different. And this is, I think, why grieving as a form of learning takes so long. And it's because the brain is really able to consult two conflicting streams of information at the same time. So on the one hand, we have the memory of the death, right? We may have sat at the bedside with our loved one caring for them, or we have a memory of that terrible phone call that we got telling us about the death of a dear one. We may have memories of memorial or funeral wakes or other graveside experiences. So on the one hand, the brain rationally knows this has happened. I have memories that this has happened, that my loved one is no longer on this earthly plane. But here's the interesting thing. Because of our attachment to this person, when we bond with another person, whether that's falling in love with our partner or falling in love with our child, or just coming to discover how close we feel to a dear friend who really sees the world the way that we do, that attachment bond in the brain comes along with a very specific belief. And that belief is, I will always be there for you, and you will always be there for me. And that belief is different from memory, isn't it? It feels different than memory. And it is, in fact, a different kind of information that the brain can encode, sometimes called semantic knowledge. So what this means is, early in acute grieving, these streams of information really conflict. On the one hand, we know the reality, the memory of the death. And on the other hand, we have this belief that our loved one is still there. They're still out there. They are there for us. And I call this the gone, but also everlasting hypothesis. And I think that this is why looking at the neuroscience of grief can help us to understand part of why it takes so long and how it's difficult to adjust to the death of a loved one, and potentially, eventually, ways that we might intervene, knowing that it is a natural process that these two pieces of information conflict, these two streams of information. Now, why would the brain evolve to do something as crazy as to have conflicting streams of information? That's just not, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And frankly, it's such a painful experience that it seems kind of cruel that the brain would organize itself in this way. Well, there is a reason for that. Some people have said, this is a quote by Kathy Shear, who does a lot of intervention research in grieving from Columbia University, and she often likes to say, grief is the form that love takes after the death of a loved one. And the reason that I think that's so important is because in order to have loss, we initially have to have a bond, right? A bonded relationship with this person. And there's a good evolutionary reason for us to have these bonds. Our loved ones are as important to our survival as food and water. They are not just optional aspects of life. They are, in fact, required for us to thrive. They help our immune system. They help our mental health. They help us in so many ways to thrive and live well. And so it is adaptive while our loved ones are with us. It's adaptive to believe that they are everlasting. Think about it this way. It would be very difficult for us to leave home every morning, to kiss our children and send them off to school, to kiss our partner and send them off to work and go out ourselves into the world, if we didn't have a deep-seated belief that we would all be back together again at the end of the day. It would just be terrifying to be out of their presence. But because of this belief, it means that even when they are not visible to us, even when we can't hear them, this belief means that we persist in believing that they are out there. And therefore, the solution to them not being in our presence is simply to go and find them, to search them out, or to create enough ruckus that they will come and find us. And while we are alive, when our children are, lost in the mall, or our spouse is, off on some business trip, it's very important that we remember that we persist in believing that they are there and they will return to us. But in the low likelihood event, thank goodness, the very rare event that a loved one dies, then this persistence in believing that they exist is not actually a good prediction any longer, but it persists nonetheless. And so we do things and we say things and we feel things that don't make a lot of rational sense. And we can tell you, we understand that the person has died, and yet it may still feel like they might walk in the room at any moment. And that, I think, is a sign of these conflicting streams of information. Death is a very abstract concept for us and really doesn't fit with this need to persist in believing that our loved one is there. So what this means is that when we bond with a loved one, that separation will then automatically produce distress. And so this is a nuance, but this is a different way of thinking about grieving. What it means is that the death of a loved one isn't just an event that happens to us in the course of events, like surviving an earthquake, right? That kind of comes out of nowhere, and then we have to deal with the stress of that. What it means is, because we have bonded with this other person, that we have formed a we in the brain. And that then when there is separation, when that person dies, a part of us is really missing, because the neural encoding has taken us to be a new entity, a two-person entity as one. And so when people say it feels as though part of me is missing, I think that also really does reflect the way the brain has encoded that bonded relationship. And we know from both human studies and even studies of animals that when we have separation from a mate that we're bonded to, we have this immediate increase in stress hormones like cortisol. And aspects of our neurochemistry, dopamine and oxytocin, really do everything they can to motivate us to seek that loved one out again, to spend time with them, to search for them. And people will describe this strange behavior bubbling up in them where they're looking for the person who has died, which they can tell you makes no sense, and yet is so strongly motivated in them. That bonding that happens, we know a little bit about how that works in the brain. And one of the things that we know about that is that there are specific brain regions that are important in creating this bond in the first place. these happen in the reward network, the basal ganglia of the brain, and specifically often in this region called the nucleus accumbens, but in aspects around that neighborhood of the basal ganglia as well. We see this in maternal love, so mothers who are looking at a photo of their child, we see this region activated. In paternal love, so a study from Germany looking at fathers in the neuroimaging scanner while they're perceiving photos of their kindergartner. Compared to some other kindergartner, they see more activation in this reward network. And we see it in romantic love as well. In people who have fallen in love, when you show their photo in the scanner, we see this same nucleus accumbens region activated. Now, here's the interesting piece. After a loved one dies, I have done studies of bereaved people, also in the neuroimaging scanner, showing them photos they've provided to us of the person who has died, comparing those photos to, say, looking at a photo of a stranger. And when we look at these individuals who participate in this research, we also ask them a lot of questions about how they're doing. We do clinical interviews to see what their experience of grief is like. And something we ask them about is that yearning, that motivation that they're experiencing in the week before we do the brain scan. So in a study of women who had lost a mother or a sister to breast cancer, we actually were able to see this same nucleus accumbens region activated when they were looking at a photo of their loved one. But here's the piece that I found most interesting. The amount of activation in that nucleus accumbens region was actually correlated with the level of yearning that they had told us they were experiencing in the week prior. So that those who were having the highest levels of yearning were showing the greatest accumbens activation. And those who had adapted in such a way that although they had wonderful memories of the person, they weren't yearning, they weren't expecting to see their loved one again, they showed lower levels of activation in this region when compared to looking at a stranger. So, neuroimaging and the neurobiology of grief is still in its very early days. There are many things that we don't know yet, but I think it gives us an interesting lens. And if there is a way in order to think about grief and grieving in new ways that helps us to talk about it with each other, then I think it is a useful perspective to take. I'm so grateful for the many funders who have contributed to this unusual line of research, and to the many trainees who work in my lab, and to all of you for having me here today and talking about this important process. Thank you.
Mary Frances, thank you. Thank you for bringing the neuroscience of grief into the ending of Creative Brain Week. I'd like to introduce my colleague here, Rebecca Strain. We've worked together for a year?
Yeah, about a year.
And we met about an hour ago. We've worked together on a project that began for the Irish Hospice Foundation during the pandemic. And as with Mary Frances, we've been able to reach through the digital realm and connect with people. And it's enabled us to do something that I'm going to explain to you a little bit, and then I'm going to hand over to Becca, and then we're going to play out with a really short video. I also want to acknowledge the colleague who isn't here.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so I'm here representing myself, Rebecca Strain, and also Martha McCulloch, who actually was the one who began the conversation with Dominic initially on this project, but Martha's not here at the moment. She's up in Donegal, and she sends her apologies. And oh, hello! That's a surprise.
Bring it.
Sorry, she doesn't have to unmute herself. She was like, come on the call there.
Hello, Martha.
Hi.
Hi!
I wasn't sure if I would be able to be here, but I'll keep quiet. But I'll just join. I'll just join for questions and answers, and I'll pass over to you, Rebecca. Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much. Oh, that's lovely.
That's fantastic.
It is.
It is. It's brilliant that you're there. Grand. So, so this work began with the Irish Hospice Foundation. Irish Hospice Foundation is the leading charity in Ireland that is working in all sorts of ways to explore, lessen the burden, help people through the processes of death, dying, loss and grief. And we know that the Hospice Foundation works within a country which largely has an acute healthcare system, which is based on the idea that you can fix things, which trains its medics to fix. And there is a point at everybody's life, we are born to go, where things can't be fixed. And yet we don't train that system to fix. And yet it happens that things can't be fixed. There's this extraordinary thing that happens that we don't know where we go. And about just over 12 months ago, so during the pandemic, the Hospice Foundation, with the support of the Creative Ireland programme, were able to initiate an arts and creative engagement programme, which I took over and led and developed. And so we started a programme during the pandemic to help people, to encourage people, to allow people, to enable people, to offer people the opportunity to make sense, to literally create things that help them make sense. To make sense at the time when the worst thing has happened, when the narrative that you have about how you will grow older together or how your lives will continue has changed. And there is not really a map for how you do that. And so we asked people, we invited people to apply for seed grants, small amounts of grants, and to tell us what it was. And it became a national audit of loss and the ability to make sense of loss, to figure out where that table is that's disappeared is, to remake sense of the world. And we know in the Hospice Foundation from grief theory that actually what happens is grief isn't an on-off switch, that over time you grow your life back like moss around a stone. You find ways of connecting out to community, and community became incredibly important. And it wasn't just community. We weren't just thinking about the individuals, the 80 people that die every day, the 800 who in an ordinary day are impacted. We were thinking about all the people impacted by the pandemic. Anybody who died during the pandemic, not just those people that died of COVID. At the weekend, on the 20th, there will be a national day of reflection and commemoration, or reflection, or something, I've forgotten what it's called now. And we'll lower flags, and that's important, and wreaths will be laid, and that's important, and a moment will be taken, and that's important. But that's not an on-off switch. Instead, it's a process, and a process requires other people. And artists, as we've said so many times, help people make a way out of no way, help people make sense. And so, after about 6 months, again with support from the Creative Ireland programme, we began the next stage, which has two strands. One stage we're about to announce, which is working with healthcare workers who have, throughout the pandemic, had been the face-to-face people. Sometimes the face-to-face people where the family is outside the window and can't come in and hold the hand. Sometimes the face-to-face people, day in, day out, going home, taking off the scrubs, separating from their family because of the potential of COVID. And we forget so quickly. And we need to remember. And we need to create places where we can remember together, where we can explore the limitations of those sensations, where our brains can then process through engaging those circuits where we now are. And so we started this project, which we called the Compassionate Culture Network. And we found 7 artist facilitators in different parts of the country. And we found support people to work with them. And we found friendly venues. And we connected everybody together because we didn't know, and nobody seemed to know, how we could do this. And so, but we knew bits of the puzzle. So we have the Bereavement Network team and the Irish Hospice Foundation. We have the Grief and Bereavement team. And so we borrowed them and we did online education for the people that were about to begin this work. And we set it up so that we would check on a regular basis. And then basically, with people in Donegal and in Kildare and in, I was getting that one wrong, Wicklow and in Galway and in Leitrim and in Buncrana Donegal, people went, okay, we are going to create a place for people to come and process loss and grief because we know we need to create those touch points, those opportunities. And we know we can do that in support. And that's how I met you two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
I guess bridges.
Bridges, oh yeah, okay, so I've got to tell you this one.
Yeah.
So whenever Dominic approached us at the start, and we had this great idea that there is the main kind of cemetery in Buncrana is at Cockhill, and near there is an old bridge. And we thought, what a great idea to set up on the bridge so that people who were visiting the cemetery would then walk past and see that there's this compassionate culture network and that there's some people gathered and that they'll come along to it. We thought that's a great idea, and it's on a bridge, great kind of image there of like the bridge. And we made a little video, myself and Martha, and we were all excited, and we got a gazebo. And on the first day, we put the gazebo up, and I went back to the car to get the sign. And when I looked over, Martha was holding onto the leg of the gazebo like Mary Poppins, about to fly into the river. So it was a good idea, but it didn't work really well. But we had been in touch with the local parish office, and we told them our sob story. And immediately they reached out to us and they said, look, here are some venues that we have that you could use. One of them is St. Mary's Hall, which is in the bottom part of the town cinema. It's right in the town centre, and we will give it to you for free to use for as long as you need. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. It was warm. It was dry. And it was safe. And so that's how we started our Compassionate Culture Network in St. Mary's Hall in Buncrana. And we kind of started initially with this idea. So I'll just talk a wee bit about my own practice, and I can't really talk about Martha's practice too much. I'll just give you a wee bit of information. But so myself, like Amir was saying earlier on, always thought that's what I want to do. I want to be an artist. And I was always very good at all the arts at school. And then I went to art college. And when I went to art college, it was the year after the Oma bomb. And my tutor was Carol Kane. And she had worked on this project called Petals of Hope. And what she'd done was, in the wake of the Oma bomb, everybody had left flowers and notes and teddies all over the town. And nobody really knew what to do with them because nobody wanted to take them away. And where do you take them away to? And so there was this just stagnation of what do we do with all this stuff? And obviously the offerings were starting to degrade and look unsightly. And so Carol came along. She had just been studying in Glasgow. She'd been studying textiles and paper making. And she came over and she was like, look, do you know what we can do? We can actually take in all those flowers and process them as a community, and we can make them into paper. And so that's what she did, and she got the support of Oma Town Council to do that, and the whole community came together. Over 150 participants came together and processed all those flowers and processed all those notes and made paper for themselves, but they also made a few large-scale pieces that went to some of the main towns that were affected by the bomb. So at that point, I realized actually art isn't about making pretty pictures. Art can be something that can transform and that can step in those really difficult places where people really don't know what to do, and to offer a process that that may not make total sense at that time, but that actually just makes the time for you to process the things that are going on. So Martha is a photographer, and she's always been quite interested in the idea of camera-less photography, a process called lumen prints, which is an interesting process where you take photographic paper, and so that's paper that's sensitive to light, and then you put an object on it and expose it to light, so you can just put it out in the back garden, and then the chemicals on the paper then start to change, and so you get an impression of an object, and so that idea of that the object has touched the paper, and so then you get a trace of this touch, and kind of like that image that Mary Frances had of the hand and the other hand, it's that kind of trace of a touch that you're kind of capturing through the process. So we started off with that I had the paper making and Martha had the lumen prints, but when we brought it to the space, we also didn't want to be, the instructors or leaders of what was going on. It was really important to us to listen to what the group wanted to do and find out what kind of processes and ideas that they had. So one of the participants had been doing soul collages for many years. So we invited her to come and teach us how to make soul collages, which is basically, it's a process where you go through magazines and sort of subconsciously pick out images and then go through a process of selecting them, cutting them out, eventually coming to a stage where you've selected a few images which you stick onto a card, and then you leave it for a few days or as long as you need to and just look at it and figure out what it is was going on in your subconscious that selected those images, and the text, it could also include text. So she showed us how to do this. There was also a participant who had written haikus, so she came and did a session teaching us how to write haikus. We also had a session where we had, so we're kind of in rural Donegal, Buncrana. Our sessions were packed with people. We can show them. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Will we show you what our sessions were like? Is that a good idea? Yeah. We've got a little video by the magic and power of Grayskull. Yeah, we're going to show you a wee video of what our sessions are like, so you can see we weren't inundated with people, but that's not important.
So my name's Martha McCulloch. I work with Artlink. It's based at Fort Dunree, and I was kind of led into this project by being introduced.
But not the one. It's fine. Don't worry about it, Eamon. Yeah.
Yeah, the one, subtitled Buncrana.
Why don't we give it a couple of seconds on the screen, and if it's the right one, we'll go with it, and if it's not the right one, we'll pause it, and you can come back to telling us the story. How about that?
Yeah.
Let's not worry too much about this. It'll be right or it won't.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like it.
We put out a kind of open call to the public and said that we would explore grief and loss through making memory books and through exploring photography, paper making, and to use creativity to kind of release some of the kind of painful feelings
and express themselves.
Every week, myself and Martha would turn up with boxes and boxes of materials and possibilities, and then we would wait. Sometimes it felt like nobody was going to come in the door, but every week somebody came in the door.
I was really interested in doing something that I was being proactive in and not just reacting to things in the world that come our way, but actually, you know, really directing my time to things that I thought really mattered. For me, it's important that there's personal experience. It's not just about an artist's practice, it's also the fact that it's my life as well that comes into this.
That was one of the reasons that I wanted to take part in this, because I wanted to learn how to support other people through grief.
I told my story, Rebecca told her story, and through us exploring our own stories, then a conversation opened up, and while we were doing that, I have a wee box of things that are all about my mum, so I was able to explain processes, but at the same time talk about ideas and my own experience and the importance of like tangible things in that process.
With material things, like actually making and being engrossed in a process of making kind of allows you to be in this kind of area of flow before you realise, you know, like an hour has passed and you've just been quietly, mindfully with yourself in the presence of other people, and I think that's the way that it can help.
I think it's always nice working with other people, doing new things. It's sort of nice and fresh too, you know, doing something creative, you know, for no particular purpose, but just coming and fiddling about with things and making something simple, doing things in a childlike way almost. And then there's that other layer of, you know, thinking about it then afterwards, delving into your feelings and all that. That was very nice as well. It's so good for your mind, I think.
We tried to keep the project loose enough that there was space for the participants to come along and say, oh, I discovered this thing, maybe we could try this. We were learning as much as the people that were coming along were learning. I think it was important not to keep on about what the subject was, but to let that kind of rise up just by sitting around a table and being involved in an activity and using your hands and then drinking tea. Then the words do come out. I mean, we found it's been very emotionally charged in a lot of these sessions.
We had a very intense session. It was very emotive. We had a lot to deal with. And through the various support that we've been getting through the Compassionate Culture Network peer support groups, we had the tools to actually deal with it. Yeah, it felt amazing to have the tools to actually deal with the situation that was on hand. And afterwards, when we were writing in our project diary, that was the real realisation that what we're doing is so important and what we're doing is really needed.
It might be swept under the carpet, but it's just such a huge part of life that it needs to be talked about. And it's healthy to be talked about.
Yeah, thanks. That was Martha. So I'm glad that you met her. And yeah, that's kind of how our sessions were. Like a few of the things that came up, like earlier today and in different sessions, about that idea that, you know, what brings you happiness is making other people happy. And I think that idea of opening the session up so that people could also introduce what they would like to do, and that they could show people things that they could do that kind of give people a purpose and show that they have value beyond just being somebody who's grieving, that actually, you know, they can actually help other people through what they're doing. Yeah.
I think we open it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, well, what do you think? There's never a plan.
I mean, I would just like to say thank you for amazing presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to Mary Frances for her beautiful exposition of the science of grief.
Oh.
Hello.
Here she is.
It was so
behind us here. Is
It
Martha?
was so wonderful.
So
We can do this.
I'm going to hand it over to the audience for some questions. I am going to regain my composure.
We think composure is slightly overrated. We think we've been sitting with this for a while, and what do we know? There's an American artist who he made this work during the height of the AIDS crisis, and his name's gone out of my head. Cortez. He makes things with like sweet wrappers. He makes the weight of his lover in sweet wrappers that sit in a corner in sweets. And when you go into a gallery, if you take a sweet, you're taking away from the weight of his lover, and he's obviously AIDS, his body became light. And you can choose to put one back. And he made a series of photographs when his lover died, when Roy died, that went around the city of San Francisco, that were the imprint of his lover in the bed. And he was asked, who did he make his work for? Could you talk about his audience? And he said, I don't make it for anybody else, I just make it for Roy. Other people are just in the room. And there's a bit of truth, I think, in what we've been doing over the last while. We can invite.
Yep. We've got Brian
Yeah,
and Ian in the background there.
We're always in the background. But wonderful presentations, but I'm just struck by the note of resonance between some of the earlier talks, I mean, about trauma and how language and the ability to communicate verbally is shut down by trauma, and how this approach, this creative approach using art, can help people open up and process the trauma. And I just wonder, we seem to be, I'm a psychiatrist, and I feel that, you know, in terms of, you know, bereavement, and we see a lot of people with unresolved grief and trying to talk things through, but failing actually to help people process the grief. You know, years after it's happened, they're stuck, and I just wonder about, is it going to the neuroscience, the brain science of this? We're taking the wrong approach. We need to help them process the trauma non-verbally, through visually, through art, through pictures, through other ways of expressing themselves. And and I think this is kind of, maybe this is obviously it's very obvious to you all, but to me as a psychiatrist, this is some enlightenment for me this week, and I would probably change my approach completely in terms of trying to help people process unresolved grief. Perhaps you could respond to that. I'd love to hear a little bit more even about the brain science of that as well from Mary, if she has any insights into how language is shut down in following trauma and grief.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, well, either way. I think one of the things we sometimes forget is that there's a lot of parts of the brain that are active that are not related to verbal processing. And so when we do things that tap into our beliefs, that belief process is not something we can just talk to ourselves and change. And even in the way that we intervene, it's often about having experiences that then are encoded in the brain, but that's not the same as talking about them. I think it's important to have a big toolkit. Talking is helpful. It is one way that we express clearly to each other our experience. But honestly, having new experiences is something that works on other parts of the brain as well. And if those can be creative, if they can be courageous, if they can be new, then our brain learns all sorts of new things it wouldn't by just sitting and talking.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary Frances. Do either of you want to come in on this one?
I was thinking about time to reflect. So Irish Hospice Foundation has just carried out this huge piece of research with, I think, 2,500, 3,000 people looking at the impact of the pandemic. And it's where we started the conversation. Trying not to build back better, trying to build different. Mm-hmm. And it'll get announced next week. He says, seeking people who were working on this in real time in the audience. Yeah. And I think one of the things it does is suggest that we need to change the way that we do care, and it's been a riff all the way through this week, that actually if we want to build a society of compassion and care, we kind of need to look at the tools that we do that with in slightly different ways. We need to use the neuroscience or the science or the data gathering or the population science or the whatever that is, census, aging. We need to use that, but we also need to acknowledge that people who are absolutely expert in their practice and their creative process need to be part of that, because they navigate in a way that they lead that in a way that other people may not. They walk to the edge of the cliff and they can dance there with people, and they can walk them back separately. And what we did with this, and I need to say thank you, because we are just about at the end of this. We're not really at the end of it. You've got another session next week, no?
I've got another session. It's our last one, and we're doing Kimsugi, which is just...
Perfect.
I know, it's so perfect.
Yeah.
So perfect. So Kimsugi is the Japanese art of repairing ceramics.
Oh, yes.
With gold. And so it's kind of about the idea that the broken things are more valuable than the new things. You know, that we are our scars, we are our brokenness, we are our grief, we are our pain, and we're better for it, even though at times it doesn't feel like it, but we are better for it. Those parts of us that are broken are the most golden parts. So I think it's really appropriate that we're doing our last session as a Kimsugi session. And just on the talking and as a way of healing, yes, it is. But you know, it's not the, like I don't know the science of it, but it's a very small amount of how we communicate is through words, and our brain. Well, yeah, I don't know, but like our body is so connected to our brain. I mean, we know this, and you know, we know that during COVID, everybody jumped in the sea. Why did everybody jump in the sea during COVID? Because they needed to. Because they needed to release what was going on for them in their bodies. And it really helped, and there's still lots of communities around the whole coast of Ireland who every single day throughout winter go out and jump in the sea every day, because it helps them. It helps them heal. It helps them deal with their grief, and it's through their body. It's not through talking about it, but it's about, like Martha was saying in the video, it's about giving that time, knowing that you're doing this to heal yourself. And it might be swimming, or it might be wrapping stones, or it might be making paper, or it might be writing, or it might be walking, but that you're saying to yourself, this is the time that I'm giving to myself for the purpose of healing, and trusting in that process.
Can I invite Martha?
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone like to? Yes. We'll let the gentleman, and then we'll draw on you. Thank you. I spotted him first out of my eye. Thank you.
Well, it was more a moment of sort of insight and light bulb going off. I was the sceptical journalist who was quoted in the Good Life Dementia course. And I realise that the greatest power of that course was the number of people who cried. And we could cry because we were with each other. And the extraordinary thing about having dementia is you're grieving for yourself. You're grieving for lost abilities. You know you have a terminal illness. You don't actually know when you're going to die. And I don't think we've really explored that enough, actually. Although, you know, between us, we'll happily talk about it, because we've all made our funeral plans we might not let on to the rest of the world. So I just want to thank you for helping me think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just putting pieces together after listening all the talks. And things that just stayed with me is just the making sense of. And I work as a psychotherapist, and I also am a health coach. And my idea of is very much going towards creating a well-being to the patients that I work with in the hospital. So in making sense of, or even creating new memories, remembering, transforming, how art, and I myself like to think I am an artist, I like to make jewelry, but I don't sell them, I make it only for myself. They mean something to me. And in that process of meaning, of maybe a loss of your health. I work with many people that had nearly a stroke, cardiac problems, and diabetes, and so they lose their sense of who they were, and now they have to deal with who are at the moment. And there is a lot of grief in the hospital settings when somebody just gets that diagnosis, and now they have to live with that person that they don't want it. They don't want to accept that. So what I am hearing in terms of grief, and today in terms of how art make or help somebody to is that bridge. No words, but in the making of new memory, new ourselves anew in that way. So I think also in terms of trauma, and for well-being, we needed a sense of safety. We need a sense of autonomy. We need a sense of joy. We need that sense within ourselves. And I think that through art, no spoken words, just creating that moment within yourself where it is safe. There is authenticity, there is joy. And how does it work in the brain? I wonder if that is a creating of a new network, or if there is just plasticity, and then memory comes in that transformation. So thank you so much for the talks, because my brain is going wild.
Thank you.
How could you help somebody, you know, and in ways that you don't need to do, but they do for themselves, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Is that not the question, though? That's the thing that connects the arts and the sciences. How can you help somebody? We might invite Martha to say hello if she wants. Yeah.
Is
And that would be
Martha
good.
there?
If you're still there.
Is Martha still there?
I'm here.
Anything to
Hi.
add?
Well, there's a couple of things I was thinking about in terms of the whole idea of photography, thinking about that. And, you know, obviously that was talked about earlier about how photographs of loved ones trigger a certain part of the brain just as much as the person themselves. And for me, my interest in photography is partly because it's a kind of such a democratic art form that so many adults don't think that they can make art. So we came across that in doing this project, that people would say, oh no, I can't do that, I can't do art. But the one thing about photography is it kind of bridges that gap where it's part of vernacular culture, it's part of our family histories. And so I like the idea that this was something that everybody could embrace, even people that didn't feel they were creative, and that was a really important aspect of using photography, as well as that sense that Rebecca said of the idea that photography is a trace. It's something that has a trace of that person, or an object that connects to that person, and that idea of the relic and the power of the relic for people who are experiencing loss. So to me, yeah, that's something I just wanted to say. And the other thing was that through, maybe Rebecca could talk a bit more about this, but through this process of, first of all, we thought we would get people to make memory books, but gradually over the course of discussions with participants and with the peer group, we realised that what we wanted to do was create a kind of a toolkit for people. So we would create something that was a memory book, but it was a memory book that was only partially filled with the things that we were exploring in the workshops and the things that people brought to the workshops, and quotations and poems and images that would trigger people's memories and experiences of loss, and that they could use those as, to create a vessel that people filled, but that we gave them we gave them prompts and we gave them things to think about that allowed them to express themselves. So that's kind of what me and Rebecca are going to be doing to kind of not bring the project to a conclusion, but to give the project a life beyond our activities with people.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? So I'm curious, you know, we're talking about in many ways profound loss, you know, the loss of a loved one. And yet in the last 2 years, I think there are so many people that have experienced what micro losses or an accumulation of losses. And now we're entering into a phase where we're going to have people joining us in our community who have experienced profound loss, either through the loss of loved ones or the loss of their lives as they knew them, as they've, you know, they come from Ukraine to join us as, you know, as part of our community. It feels to me that there's value in sort of, you know, rolling this out in schools so that we, in a way, we have a generation of either students, certainly in here in Trinity, or, you know, I think about my nieces and they're 9 and 11, and, you know, the losses in their lives, and how do we take what we've learned in these fabulous projects and sort of start to think about mainstreaming them? Or is there a value in that? Is there a way of embedding some of this in education, like in primary education, or in secondary education, or even in acknowledging that we are all emerging from a period of great loss as a wider community? Or is that too big an ask?
I think I think that there's not just one answer. There's always plural answers, and I think like what Damien Murphy was saying, that it's about keeping it local and about working with the people within that space. And what works, like what we were doing the Compassionate Culture Network, what works in Buncrana doesn't work in Galway City, doesn't work in Dublin, doesn't work in, you know, so I think like just mass rolling it out and saying, here's a programme.
I can take on that, and then we kind of need to come to a close. Yeah. And we are still in the process of finishing this and starting it on the other hand, and starting, so we arrive in the middle of the story is ongoing. But one of the fundamental things is that, and not art, creativity doesn't scale. It's the wrong metaphor, it's the wrong language. What creativity does is it propagates. So we drop an idea into Creative Brain Week and off it will go. And it's about how do you nurture those seeds? It's a more organic process, and therefore, what we need to do as, you know, serious grown-ass adults is think about the structures that we work in. As Gretchen Addy and Bianca Stern were saying in their recipe on the Sunday, we can make almost organic systems of care and relationship that are economically sustainable, that will survive. It's as Ian might say in his closing, it's an evolution from an industrial model or a post-industrial model to something else, which accepts that us and the rocks are interconnected in some way that we don't fully understand because we don't quite have the scientific tools to do it, but we have an inkling of it, and we can leave it better than we found it.
Great. Okay. Well, on that note, do we have any other questions from the audience? No? Well, I would like to thank Dominic and Becca and Martha and Mary Frances, who are, I hope, still with us, to say, thank you very much. And I think it will be important to give everyone a round of applause. Thank you for joining us remotely. Thank you for a fabulous session.
Thank you.
And thank you all for participating.